I wasn't planning on falling for anyone the week I moved back to Cedar Falls. I was planning on fixing up my late grandfather's old house, keeping to myself, and getting through the worst storm season the county had seen in a decade without losing a single shingle. Then the sky opened up on a Tuesday night, and everything I'd planned went sideways in about the time it takes lightning to strike a tree. My name is Caleb Hart, and I'd spent the last 8 years working construction 2 states away, coming home only for holidays and funerals, until my grandfather passed and left me his house at the edge of town, half falling apart and entirely mine to fix. I'd been back 3 weeks, mostly keeping to myself, when the storm rolled in fast and mean off the ridge, the kind of storm the local news spent all afternoon warning people about and half the county ignored anyway. I was checking my own roof for damage when I saw it, a single porch light flickering through the sheeting rain from the house 2 properties down, the old Ashford place, and beneath it, unmistakably, the pale gleam of a tarp flapping loose where a section of roof had clearly given way. I knew the house. Everyone in Cedar Falls knew the house, the one Brynn Ashford had moved back into a year earlier after her divorce, quiet and mostly kept to herself, same as I did, though for entirely different reasons. I'd seen her exactly twice since I got back, once at the hardware store, once driving past on the county road, and both times I'd caught myself thinking about her longer than I had any right to for a woman I barely knew. I grabbed my tarp kit and a flashlight and headed over through the storm without really thinking it through, because leaving someone alone with a torn-up roof during weather like that wasn't a decision, it was just what you did in a town like Cedar Falls, whether you knew the person well or not. Brynn opened the door before I even knocked, soaked from trying to deal with the roof herself, a bucket already half full of rainwater sitting in her front hallway where the ceiling had started to leak. "I saw your light," I said, raising my voice over the storm. "Figured you could use a hand with that roof before the whole thing gives out." She stared at me for a second, water dripping down her face, exhausted and clearly overwhelmed, and something in her expression cracked with obvious relief. "Caleb Hart," she said. "I heard you were back in town. I did not expect you to show up on my porch during a hurricane." "It's not technically a hurricane," I said, "but I take your point. Can I come in and take a look at the damage?" She let me in, and the next 2 hours passed in a blur of flashlights and tarps and me climbing out onto her roof and whether no sane person should have been climbing onto anything in, patching the worst of the damage well enough to hold until the storm passed. By the time I climbed back down, soaked to the bone and thoroughly exhausted, the worst of the storm had rolled past, leaving steady rain and distant thunder in its wake. "You didn't have to do all that," Brynn said, handing me a towel in her kitchen, her own hair damp and clinging in loose waves she'd clearly given up trying to manage. "You could have just called someone in the morning. Your ceiling was actively caving in," I said. "Morning would have been a very different, very expensive problem." She laughed, tired but genuine, and something about the sound of it settled warm in my chest, unexpected and a little unwelcome given how carefully I'd been planning to keep to myself since coming back to town. "Well, I owe you," she said. "At minimum a drink and a dry pair of socks. The roads are a mess out there anyway. I don't love the idea of you driving back in this." "I'm fine to drive," I said, though the offer had a pull to it I hadn't expected. "Stay," she said, simply, the word landing quieter than the rest of the conversation, something more sincere underneath it than just concern about the roads. "Please." I know it's a strange thing to ask someone I've barely spoken to twice. But I've been alone in this house dealing with storms and leaking ceilings for a year now, and honestly, it would be nice not to be alone tonight, even if it's just until the worst of the weather passes. I looked at her, soaked and tired and asking for something so much simpler than what the moment felt like, and understood, standing there dripping on her kitchen floor, that whatever careful plan I'd made about keeping to myself this year had just quietly, completely fallen apart. "Yeah," I said. "I'll stay." I ended up staying the whole night, though nothing happened beyond 2 mugs of coffee and a long conversation at her kitchen table while the storm wound down outside, both of us too wired from the adrenaline of the evening to consider sleeping. Brynn talked about the divorce, carefully at first, then more openly once it became clear I wasn't going to judge or push, about moving back to Cedar Falls to start over somewhere familiar, about the strange loneliness of rebuilding a life alone in a house that used to hold 2 people's plans instead of just her own. I talked, in turn, about the 8 years away, about coming back for my grandfather's funeral and staying because the house felt like unfinished business I wasn't ready to sell off to a stranger. We talked until nearly 3 in the morning, and by the time I finally left, driving carefully home through the last of the drizzle, I understood something had shifted that I hadn't expected when I grabbed my tarp kit and headed out into the storm. I told myself, over the following days, that it was just neighborly concern, the kind of thing anyone would have done for anyone else in a town like Cedar Falls. It got harder to believe that story the more excuses I found to check on her roof repair, first to properly fix what I'd only patched during the storm, then simply because I wanted an excuse to see her again. You know, Brynn said, the third time I showed up at her door with a toolbox, at this point I think you're just finding reasons to come over. The roof genuinely needed real repair work, I said. The tarp job wasn't going to hold forever. She said, arms crossed, though she was smiling. And today? What's the excuse today? I set down the toolbox, deciding, standing there on her porch with the afternoon sun finally breaking through weeks of storm clouds, that I was done pretending the excuses were about the roof at all. Today I don't have one, I admitted. I just wanted to see you. Something warm passed across her face, careful hope she seemed almost afraid to fully let show. That's a much better answer, she said, and stepped aside to let me in anyway, toolbox or no toolbox. We spent that afternoon actually finishing the roof repair together, Brynn insisting on helping despite my protests that she didn't need to, and somewhere between passing shingles and trading easy jokes, the last of the careful distance between us gave way entirely. Can I ask you something? She said, once we'd finished, both of us sitting on the porch steps watching the sun start to set over the ridge. That first night, during the storm. Why'd you actually stay when I asked you to? Because you asked, I said. And because some part of me had been hoping for a reason to talk to you properly since I got back to town, and the storm just happened to hand me one. I'd noticed you too, she admitted. Before that night. I saw you at the hardware store a few weeks back and spent an embarrassing amount of time afterward wondering if I'd ever get a reason to actually talk to you. Well, I said, the storm did us both a favor, apparently. She laughed, leaning into my shoulder, comfortable in a way that felt entirely new and entirely right at the same time. I haven't let myself want anything like this since the divorce, she said, quieter now. It's scary, if I'm honest. Wanting something again after spending a year convincing myself I was better off alone. I get that, I said. I've spent 8 years telling myself I didn't need to put down roots anywhere, that moving around for work was easier than staying somewhere long enough to actually build something real. Coming back here, fixing up my grandfather's house, some part of me has been scared this whole time that settling down means risking losing something again, the way I lost him. So we're both a little scared, she said. Seems like it. Good, she said, smiling up at me in the fading evening light. I'd rather be scared together than pretend I'm not scared at all. I kissed her then, on that porch step with the sunset painting the sky orange behind the ridge, and whatever careful plans either of us had made about staying guarded quietly, completely fell apart, replaced by something neither of us had expected to find so soon after moving back to a town we'd both come to as a kind of retreat rather than a fresh start. The trouble, when it came, arrived in the form of Brynn's ex-husband, showing up in Cedar Falls 3 weeks later with no warning and considerably more nerve than he had any right to after the way the divorce had gone. I found out about it secondhand, from the diner waitress who mentioned offhand that she'd seen a strange car parked outside the Ashford place that morning, and by the time I got over there, worried without fully understanding why, Brynn was standing on her porch looking pale and shaken, a man I didn't recognize climbing back into his car and driving off down the county road. You okay? I asked, taking the porch steps 2 at a time. He wants to talk, Brynn said, arms wrapped around herself despite the warm afternoon. Apparently he's had some kind of change of heart about the divorce. Thinks we rushed into ending things. He wants to try again. Something cold settled in my chest at that. Do you want to try again? No, she said immediately, firmly, and some of the tension in my chest eased at the certainty in her voice. I don't want him back, Caleb. I want you. But him showing up like this, out of nowhere, after a year of silence, it's rattled me more than I expected. I thought I'd made my peace with all of that, and having him standing on my porch again brought back a lot of feelings I thought I'd already worked through. Over the following week, her ex called repeatedly, showed up twice more, apparently determined to win back what he'd let go of carelessly a year earlier. Brynn handled it as firmly as she could, but I watched the stress of it wear on her, old insecurities resurfacing that had nothing to do with me directly but affected everything between us anyway. I need some space to deal with this, she told me one evening, after a particularly draining phone call with her ex's lawyer about some leftover property dispute from the divorce. Not from you exactly. Just space to get my head straight without worrying about how it's affecting whatever's happening between us. I understand, I said, though the words cost me more than I let on. Take whatever time you need. The space stretched longer than either of us probably wanted, nearly 2 weeks of careful distance while Brynn dealt with the fallout of her ex's unwelcome return, and I spent most of that time fighting my own old fear, the one I'd admitted to her on that porch step, that wanting something real meant risking losing it, that maybe the space she needed was the beginning of losing her the way I'd lost my grandfather, slowly and then all at once. It was Brynn who finally broke the silence, showing up at my door on a quiet evening 2 weeks later, looking steadier than she had in weeks. I sorted it out, she said. Told him clearly, one final time, that I'm not interested in going backward, and had my lawyer handle the property dispute so there's no more reason for him to keep showing up. I'm sorry I pulled away the way I did. I think some part of me got scared that his sudden reappearance meant I hadn't actually moved on as fully as I thought, and I needed to prove to myself that I had before I could come back to you certain of what I actually want. And now? Now I'm certain, she said. It was never him I wanted, Caleb. Not for one single second of any of this. I just needed to close the door properly before I could focus fully on the one I actually want to walk through. I was scared too, I admitted. Watching you pull away, even for good reasons, brought up every fear I'd been carrying about putting down roots somewhere and then losing what I built there. I know that's not fair to put on you, given everything you were dealing with, but I want to be honest that the last 2 weeks weren't easy for me either. Then let's agree, Brynn said, stepping closer, to actually talk to each other next time something rattles us, instead of retreating into old fears separately. I don't want either of our pasts running this relationship from the sidelines. Deal, I said, and pulled her into the kind of hug that said more than either of us managed to put into words right then, relief and certainty and the quiet, steady understanding that whatever fears either of us still carried, we were choosing, deliberately, to face them together instead of alone. The rest of that year passed easier than the weeks surrounding her ex's brief, unwelcome return, both of us more careful now about communicating instead of retreating whenever old fears surfaced. I finished the renovations on my grandfather's house properly, no longer treating it as a temporary project but as something I intended to actually build a life in, and Brynn's roof, fully repaired months earlier, became something of a running joke between us, the thing that had started it all. We got married the following autumn, a small ceremony in the backyard of my grandfather's house, string lights strung between the trees, half the town of Cedar Falls in attendance because that's simply how things worked in a place that small. Brynn wore her hair loose and simple, no elaborate styling, just herself, steady and certain in a way that made the whole day feel less like a performance and more like the natural conclusion of everything we'd built since that first storm-soaked night. Standing at the makeshift altar we'd built beneath the old oak tree, watching her walk toward me across the yard, I thought back to that Tuesday night 18 months earlier, checking my own roof for storm damage and catching sight of a flickering porch light 2 properties down. I hadn't planned on falling for anyone that week. I definitely hadn't planned on driving through a storm to fix a stranger's roof, or staying the whole night at her kitchen table, or any of the 18 months that followed, each one steadily, quietly building toward the life we now stood in the middle of. Any regrets? Brynn asked later that evening, once most of the guests had gone home and we sat together on the same porch steps where I'd first kissed her, the same porch her ex had once stood on, now fully, entirely ours. Not one, I said. Best decision I ever made was grabbing that tarp kit and heading out into the storm. I'm glad you did, she said, leaning into me, the weight of her settling comfortable and familiar against my side. Though for the record, I think I'd have found a way to ask you to stay eventually, storm or no storm. Maybe, I said, but I'm glad we didn't have to wait to find out. We sat there a long while, watching the last of the string lights flicker in the evening breeze, and I understood, holding her close on that porch, that some of the best things in life show up exactly the way that storm had, unexpected and a little inconvenient, asking nothing more than for you to answer honestly when someone finally, quietly, asks you to stay. She was alone when the storm hit that night, needing nothing more from me than a fixed roof and someone to sit with her until the worst of the weather passed. I found the rest of my life instead, and I've been grateful for that storm, and everything it brought with it, every single day since.